How are you doing? Thumbs up, ready to go? Wonderful. So welcome everyone to another exciting event with the Center for Global Education. Today we're talking about UNDRIP and the rights of Indigenous peoples. UNDRIP is a framework that has been developed by the UN, and many countries have voted for it and subscribed to it. Canada, initial reluctance, but I'm sure we are going to talk about the history of UNDRIP. I'm going to leave that to our wonderful guest speaker, Connor Kerr, who's joining us from Edmonton, and myself, I'm joining from Edmonton as well, which is Treaty 6 land. And so as a part of my welcome, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional meeting grounds and gathering place and traveling route of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and all wonderful knowledge, all the many First Nations and Métis and Inuit footsteps who have marked these lands for centuries. Apart in Canada, I know we have people who are joining us today from Bangladesh. We have people registered to join us from Brazil. We have people registered to join us from Peru and Australia. And I know the Australians are sleeping right now because it's about 3 a.m. So I have a feeling they've logged on for the link and will be joining us on the live stream. And I can see that we have a bunch of people on the live stream who are here with us today. And so reconciliation and UNDRIP and Indigenous peoples and land acknowledgements are very much part of the current discourse in Canada. And as we move, Canada was before settlers and colonizers arrived from Europe and other continents, there was a rich cultural heritage of people who lived on the land in Canada, in what we now call Canada. And the history that happened after colonization is one of full of hope and relationships and fragility and sadness and cultural desecration, and is just this a mass of emotions and political and upheaval and change and inspiring stories. And so as we move to sort of understand these dynamics, and as we move as a nation and a community and as relationships to each other to understand what all these things mean, we go through a process of reconciliation, and Canada's very much undergoing that now. And through that is land acknowledgements. So today I acknowledge that I'm joining from Treaty 6. And for me, that is saying that I, as a settler to this land, with a colonizer heritage, that I understand that people were here long before I was with a rich culture, and that I have an opportunity and a privilege and a responsibility to listen and learn and hear these stories and understand what my role is in helping other people hear those stories and learning from all of the knowledge that came before I was here. So I want to welcome all of you from wherever you're joining us from, whether it be Bangladesh or whether it be BC, to our conversation today on UNDRIP. And I'd like to introduce our speaker, Connor Kerr. He is a Métis educator, writer, and harvester. He was raised in Buffalo Pound Lake, Saskatchewan, and his family is descended from the Lac St. Anne and Fort de Prairie Métis communities. He's the manager of Indigenous Relations Supports at Norquest College, which is here in Edmonton, and a sessional instructor at the Pemahissoin program. I practiced that a whole bunch, and then I still stumbled on it, which is at McEwen University. And from my understanding, the word means sort of like career or like vocation, but I know that there's also a rich interpretation of that doesn't come across in translation, and I'm sure Connor's going to tell us all about it. His writing has appeared in literary magazines such as Grain, Right Across Canada, and the Mahalat Review. He's a recipient of Fiddlehead's 2019 Ralph Gustafson Poetry Award. Connor, you're amazing. Welcome today to our conversation on UNDRIP. Sometimes I read these introductions and I'm just like, dude, what have I done with my life? Because you have just such a rich, amazing background and experience, a poet, an academic, social support, knowledge keeper. You are just a dynamic and and I want to welcome you to our conversation today. I can't wait to hear you lead us through it.
Yeah, usually I like to talk about my magpie interpretation skills as well as my abilities to wrestle Labrador retrievers, but I left them out of that bio there. So.
Well, we're working from home, so maybe we'll see some of those laboratory dog wrestling abilities later. As
They're sleeping right now, but we'll see if they get going.
Thank you so much for joining today. Is there anything else you'd like to say about who you are, or where you work, and some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah, so Tansa and Yato Tramatik Yatamaskatana Awika Kiao Konakra Nitsigatsu and Manitou Saga Higanako Sinia. So my name's Connor. I'm from the Métis communities of Lac Saint Anne. And it's an honor to be here today, and thanks to Sarah for inviting me to come in and speak to this topic. When I'm speaking these kind of things, I always like to acknowledge that I am just bringing my own voice and the voices of my family to this, and there's a lot of different community interpretations and all these pieces of legislation and different aspects out there. And so it's one of the things we're trying to encourage as Indigenous educators to not share this pan-Indigenous approach to all content and knowledge, but recognize the local nuances to these different pieces. So when I'm speaking to this, I'm speaking mainly on how this has impacted like my family and my work as an Indigenous educator and writer, and not necessarily like this broad, North American Indigenous kind of collective piece either. Sorry, I gotta run very, very quickly. My vacuum is beeping. I'll be right back.
And such is live events. Maybe we'll go, and I see that we have educators here from Calgary, from BC. We have a student joining us from Kenya. Awesome to see you, Ian. It's always great when you're able to join us. If anyone wanted to do, I wanted to let you all know that we have a few people here in the room. We also have a bunch of people I can see joining us on the live stream. Now I'm on both. So if you're on the live stream and you have a question, you can type it in the chat and I'll relay it here into the meeting. I know some school districts right now have policies around using Zoom. And hopefully they'll change, because Zoom's really upped their game lately. And I think that maybe we'll revisit it come the fall. But if you're on the live stream, no problem. You can be interactive in our meeting. And if you're here in the meeting and you don't want to interrupt, but you have a question, be sure to just write it in the chat. We'll get to you as soon as we can. All right, welcome back, Connor.
Sorry about that. My partner made me get a Roomba, and when I got my last dog, so yeah, I'll share my screen for the presentation here to kind of start speaking to those things. Okay, is that good?
Looks great.
Okay. Yeah, so once again, thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit to this piece. So as I mentioned the bio there, I work at Norquest College, which is our community college in Edmonton, Alberta. We have about 14,000 credit learners and about 19,000 total. And within that, we have about 1,000 Indigenous students. I'm not totally particular in the numbers, but I just want to mention that because Edmonton is a very diverse Indigenous city. We're the gateway to the north, and we have a large Indigenous community here. And I feel fortunate because this is a space where my family has lived for generations and generations. I was raised by this lady here who's my grandmother, and she actually moved to Vancouver Island last year at the age of 87. But my grandmother's grandmother was born on a First Nation that existed within the Edmonton area here, the Papas Chase First Nation, which no longer is here. It was dissolved by the Canadian government back in the 1880s when they realized the land that was allocated to them through Treaty 6 was very valuable farmland, and for the expansion of what was the city of Strathcona, they needed to take it. So there's a lot of documentation done on the Papas Chases, like illegal surrender, that's out there. But I just want to speak to that just because of the connection to this land and this area. which Indigenous peoples have been inhabiting since time immemorial. And on my matriarchal lineage of my family, we go back into that basically forever. My first kind of European ancestor in this area was a guy named Francois Gladue, who arrived in the 1790s as part of Northwest Company Voyageur fur trading brigades. And he never left once he arrived here as a 14, 15-year-old man. And his family and a few other families were the forming members of the Lac Saint Anne Métis community, which is a really well recognized and still to this day community where they have the Lac Saint Anne pilgrimage and are very notable in Métis kind of politics. A lot of recognized artists and intellectuals come from that community, and feel very fortunate to be in this kind of territory. And in this territory too, we talk about how the free moving peoples in this were really under Indigenous governance laws and societies well into the 1880s. 1870s, 1880s. This was essentially really Cree, Métis, and Blackfoot territory up until that point. And there's Indigenous governance systems that existed all throughout this area. The European communities at the time were very much limited to the fur trading posts where the peoples were and they were under the Indigenous governance systems for the most part, which were often on these matriarchal lines and lineages. And without the matriarchs within my family, I wouldn't have the opportunity to be able to speak here today. I'm very proud that I'm descended from such strong kind of revolutionaries and people who've made sure to keep their voices loud and to share their Métis culture proudly. My family, once the Papas-Chase First Nation was dissolved, we ended up in the St. Paul area with a whole bunch of other peoples, including Chief Papas-Chase, who passed away from the Spanish flu influenza in the 1918, 1919 timeframe there, which I just find very relevant to this day, where it was almost exactly 100 years ago that this was taking place in this territory here. And the city of Edmonton looked a lot different at that time. The peoples living in this area were known as like the Miskwachi Nehewak, the Beaver Hills Cree. They weren't known by these First Nation names or reservation names that exist right now, like Enoch and Papas-Chase and Alexander and Alexis. Those were colonial constructs that were put in place with the signing of Treaty 6 and the legislation that came afterwards. That was not how the Indigenous peoples in this territory, in this land, referred to themselves. But it's a very beautiful, beautiful area here. And I feel very fortunate to be able to work and support Indigenous learners and to learn more about this on a daily basis. I'm fortunate that I've spent a lot of time with some very amazing elders over the past few years and learning from their knowledge and their wisdom, as well as the youth and children. As an educator and working right in an Indigenous student center, I'm often amazed by just the level of connection, the community that our Indigenous students have, and how they're looking at bettering the futures for themselves, for their families, and most importantly for their communities, and this collective good that they want to bring forward there. And today in particular, I'll speak to a few different kind of pieces of legislation and how they've kind of affected these kind of pieces. But I also want to mention just that, I think I mentioned it earlier. Yeah, I'm just speaking more for like myself and my family and some of the teachings that I've got from elders, not as like this Indigenous kind of pan voice that you often hear there. So. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm going to give a very, 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 very basic overview. There's been a lot of great academic work done on this. You can access the full document very easily online if you want to do follow-up research on this or read more about it and what it actually entails. The general gist of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was formed and written from after about 25 years of consultation, engagement, deliberation, and debate at the United Nations on what this would eventually look like. But it really entails and gets into how Indigenous peoples need to be recognized within the lands that they inherently call their homelands, and how that the nation states that are colonial and imposed on these lands need to recognize those inherent rights and make sure that they're upholding the self-governance systems and the right to freedom of cultural expression, traditional expression, histories, oral traditions, and the freedom for Indigenous peoples to be able to express that at any given moment or any given time. And it really comes into a big play with land claims. Land claims and different definitions of traditional territories, as well as treaty rights and negotiations, and a whole bunch of different like minute aspects that I'm sure the lawyers got right into there. But on a general like kind of just thing, it's basically saying that we need nation states need to give Indigenous peoples the rights to be able to negotiate on a nation-to-nation basis, as well as to implement their own systems of self-governance, have language revitalization, bring in their, have the right to education in their own way and systems, and not necessarily having to rely and be beholden to these other countries, which was incredibly interesting because when this first came forward in September 13th of 2007, 144 countries signed it immediately. 11 abstained, and then 4 countries did not support it and were very adamantly opposed to it at that time. That being Canada, New Zealand, the United States, and Australia. And if you think of those 4 countries in particular, they all have a very colonial history with their Indigenous peoples in those areas, as well as a very like prominent and continuing systems of colonialism that are in place or are placed on their Indigenous peoples that are living within those nations. New Zealand and Australia within the next kind of 2-3 years said that they were going to support and implement the rights that were being created by the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The United States, I believe, is still kind of a little bit on the fence about it. I might be wrong on that. And then Canada was very adamantly against it. And the biggest thing that came from that was the Indigenous Relations Minister at the time that was under Stephen Harper's conservative government, a guy named Michael Straw, I believe. I might be wrong on his name. He said that we already do all these things, that we already have all the policies and legislations in place to support Indigenous peoples within Canada, and there's no need for us to sign on to something like UNDRIP because we already do all of the things that are in place there. But a lot of academics and renowned academics at the time, and others, lawyers, community agencies, grassroots movements, Indigenous communities, first and foremost, elders, youth, basically we're like, no, you don't, and we should be looking at how we can implement this kind of legislation. So in 2010, Canada's conservative government under Stephen Harper said they would support it in whatever that looked like. But I mean, that's very much like government kind of were, just like, oh yeah, we will support that. And then nothing really came from that. In 2016, Canada's Liberal government under Justin Trudeau said they would adopt it. And so the interesting thing about pieces of legislation like this is on a community kind of impact, they mean very little. As if you're an Indigenous person living a day-to-day kind of life, there's not much that really changes in your day-to-day life from one of these pieces of legislation that are being put through. Like in 2007, I would have been in university, and I had no idea that there was something like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm sure a few other people on the faculty of Native Studies where I was would have, but like for myself, that meant absolutely nothing. For my cousins, that meant absolutely nothing. And for my family, that meant absolutely nothing, because there was nothing that came from it that directly benefited us. and so we like, this is just one of those things that just kind of passes you by, or you don't really notice. But one thing that UNDRIP really did do was it kind of set the framework and the basis for the government's actions towards the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and starting the process to move towards those 94 calls to action that came from that. And I highly recommend that everyone looks up those 94 calls to action and how those move forward, because that is, though it's government funded, it was Indigenous led by some very prominent peoples who put those together, and the calls on how you can create better relationships with Indigenous peoples and move towards reconciliation within your own work as educators or any other area, essentially. UNDRIP to this point is still kind of a heavily debated topic within Canada. And the biggest thing that kind of comes from that, and I mentioned earlier, is this notion of land claims and traditional land territories, and the rights that are beholden to those. And there's a huge pushback against UNDRIP and those kind of things, because to enact one of those looks into recognizing the rights to these areas, which would then legally set the precedent for Indigenous communities to regain their land, to get land back, and to move towards those kind of grassroots movements that are happening, as well as their community movements, where if you're not recognizing that kind of thing, then you're not beholden to having to give any of the land back that was happening within these kind of systems.
Exactly. One of the questions that came off of our live stream right now is what's that legal nature between the Canada and UNDRIP through the UN, and what legal sort of bindingness does that cause by acknowledging that? So thank you for preemptively addressing the question.
Yeah. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't like reading like that or analyzing. But from what I've kind of gathered and read is that when UNDRIP was signed, that essentially put it into international law. And from what I've read from some Indigenous academics, that became a piece of international law at that point that essentially Canada is not recognizing right now. And like, I'm sure there's more on that I'm not qualified to kind of speak to, but there's a huge kind of legal debate around what that implementation would really look like, and what the legal ramifications from that would actually be if that came forward, in terms of these. And the big piece is the land claims around that. Like, everyone loves a feel-good story about, hey, there's a bunch of new people and youth that learn the language here and there. Like, the government will always say that that's a great thing that came forward here. But when it comes to these financial obligations and these judicial fiscal responsibilities, land is a huge driver of that. And the idea of having to share this or give land back really puts things into this government legal perspective, where they don't want to do that or move towards those kind of things. Like in the Papas Chase First Nation territories, which is now basically just the city of Edmonton on the south side where I currently live, like, you can't give that land back. You'd have to give essentially the entire south side of Edmonton at this point if you're recognizing the territory and the title of the Indigenous peoples to that area. It's a huge piece. And so one of the I use these photos in every single presentation I do. I took most of these out at some of the areas around the Edmonton territory here. So this is the main piece with this is how it's kind of or another piece, not the main piece, is how this has informed the Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. And it sets the precedents for the legal, or not the legal, sorry, but the political bodies, such as the Assembly of First Nations or the Métis General Council, or these others, the Inuit political bodies, to kind of move forward in their debates and their negotiations and their discussions with with the Canadian government, but on a more kind of grassroots, personal like level here, it's this ongoing kind of colonial intervention by Canada by not recognizing that Indigenous, like not recognizing the relationship and the importance of that with Indigenous peoples by not signing on to UNDRIP immediately. And like I mentioned, like you can say you support these kind of things, but until that actually comes into grounded action and grounded movement and grounded support, and the not fighting Indigenous peoples at every single step of the way on these kind of policies, that's when you start truly moving towards building a better relationship and the concept of reconciliation, or probably what the new buzzword will be, like decolonization there. So if you're recognizing these, if you're recognizing this legislation and starting to move towards it without fighting it on every step, then you're not fighting like the funding that was going to be given to children's services organizations that work on First Nations that have been historically very, very underfunded over the last few years, or recognizing the impacts of the 60s scoop and the millennial scoop and the continued ongoing colonization through the the prison systems, as well as the the child intervention system as well. And moving towards this in a shared kind of responsibility and goal of creating a better future for Indigenous peoples. One of the big things too is the idea of this inherited wealth or generational wealth that doesn't exist within Indigenous communities for the most part, where if you're looking at non-Indigenous communities, there's usually an intergenerational wealth component that enables better futures for the peoples that are there. You have that transfer down where you're able to access different educational opportunities or job opportunities, these other pieces where within Indigenous communities, that doesn't exist, that doesn't happen. In like my family, I was the first one to graduate from, or even attend university, let alone graduate from one. And it's not, and I recognize that, and the privilege that I've had of doing that comparatively to some of the other members of my family, where that doesn't happen. And by recognizing something like UNDRIP and moving that forward, you can start actually building the steps and the capacity for intergenerational wealth transfer within Indigenous communities that will allow peoples to gain the opportunities and access to build the futures that they need in this area. And I guess that does speak a little bit more to that kind of local level for Indigenous peoples here. I mean, I always kind of think of like my grandmother as a prime example of who is like, if you're looking at one, or my one cousin as well, but if you're looking at these legislations and these different bills, if you put something forward, like even the TRC or UNDRIP or Royal Proclamation of Aboriginal Peoples back in '96, she'd just be like, oh, it's just more like government, it's just more government talk. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. They don't want me to succeed. They don't want my family to succeed. So why would I bother caring about that? Why would that impact me on any level whatsoever? And until we actually see governments from the municipal to the provincial to the federal level working on a nation-to-nation relationship and building that common partnership with Indigenous peoples and movements and grassroots organizations, we're going to be stuck in these kind of cycles where we go through these movements where we have, after the '96 Royal Proclamation on Aboriginal Peoples, there's this huge spike in the interest of Indigenous issues, essentially. And then it drops off in the early 2000s once it no longer becomes a hot topic in the media. And then it picks up again kind of with the talk around UNDRIP in 2008, 2009, once it became kind of more known. And then tails off again, and now we're into we're still kind of in the limbo, or from the TRC back in 2014, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sorry, back in 2014, where we're still kind of in the upswing from that, but we're starting to see that even decrease a little bit in the last little while for the interest on in a national level on working with Indigenous communities. And and I strongly, but in like the 2020s, at some point there will be another piece of legislation or another bill or something move forward that just essentially restates the same things over and over, that they need to recognize like Indigenous culture, heritage, language, the histories, the traditions, the land, first and foremost above all. And if that doesn't actually happen, then we're not able to start moving forward, and we just become part of these kind of cycles. This is actually, I don't know, Adam, if you remember this. This was when we were doing those one credit weekends with Edmonton Public Schools, where we were bringing Indigenous students out to do kind of cultural activities and get a credit through their programming for these land-based learning educational opportunities. And one of the things that these this bill, like UNDRIP and others, talk about is the recognition of Indigenous educational systems, which I think is pretty important for a conversation like this as well. And knowing that, especially as we see our education system changing intensely within a week back in the beginning of March there with the advent of COVID-19 and everything that came from that, we can see how we can change educational systems for the better. And Indigenous education is inherently connected back to the land and the cultural ties to that and the language that comes from it. And it always has been. I always laugh because land-based learning became a buzzword in the last kind of couple of years here. And I love it as a buzzword because I'm able to get government funding for my programs by just saying it over and over and over again in government applications when I put it forward to get grants. But it's great because we're able to actually create programming that goes back to the land, where we're utilizing elders and knowledge keepers and cultural advisors to help advise our programming. And you see the difference within the students and the kids' lives when they get to go back onto these, back in these communities, where the formal education systems that we're using now within a Western system it's very, very new comparatively to the way that Indigenous education has been for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years beforehand, where it's all inherently connected back to the animals, the land, the nature, everything that comes with that. And it's a learning system that's based around the teachings of elders, but also the youth too, and what they're gaining, what they're learning as they come forward on those kind of pieces. I always like this one example, whereas this was back when I was working with Paul First Nation Children's Services, and we were setting up these kind of cultural camps for weeks during the summer months. And there was a young kid who was living in a group home in Edmonton, and his social worker drove him out. He had no family and dropped him off. And the social worker just gave me the roundabout immediately where, oh, this kid's diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, like just named a list of every single thing that this kid was diagnosed with from a Western kind of perspective. And she's like, so if he's not paying, like you're going to have to watch, et cetera, et cetera. And then this kid, this young man, he was like just enthralled and mesmerized and amazed by like what the elder was talking about while we were picking medicines on that day in particular, when we were looking for sage and sweetgrass. And he was right on that elder's knee the entire time, like just hanging off of it, basically learning and listening. And you could just see his connection back to the land and how this was the educational system that worked for him. That this was how he could learn, was through this experiential land-based learning, and getting in that reconnection back to the roots and the cultural aspects there. And like, if you were looking at him right then, you would never, ever, ever talking to him have thought of any of those Western diagnoses on his person would have existed. That this kid was just, the absolute best kid. And he came every day and he was an absolute delight when he was out there and everything. And I remember right there just recognizing, and I was pretty young when I was doing those camps, and I remember just thinking right then, like, this is what it's all about right here, is bringing education back to the land and having this start to be legislated. So in something like United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when it talks about the recognition of education systems, starting to look at how we are quantifying that in a Western kind of or Western education systems that are imposed over this. So in my work at like the Norquest Community College as well as MacEwan University, we often talk about how, you know, we're going to decolonize education and we're going to bring this forward, but we're still doing arbitrary grading methods as well as, you know, just still that classroom approach to most pieces where we're not bringing it back to that circle, bringing it back to that conversation and looking into how Indigenous education has kind of rolled forward for the thousands of years beforehand and how it does connect back to this land and how we need to recognize that first and foremost. And I know we're big on, and I've always been big in my entire career on making sure that the elders and knowledge keepers that are assisting us in our work in the post-secondaries that I work with, but even before when I worked in government and with the school board and other areas, that we're paying them and we're paying them on the same level as someone with like a PhD, a doctoral level degree, where, you know, we're recognizing that they are the, I don't like to use the word experts, but they are the experts in their kind of fields. All the elders I know would hate if I used the word expert or something like that, but they,
it's just another time when the words don't fit, right? Where,
oh yeah,
where they just don't carry the weight that's needed, or you know, you commodify a relationship when really it's so enriched in community.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I just talked about that too, but got ahead of myself there. So I always like this picture because it kind of just goes back, and you can see this is a little bit older because the Stantec building and the JW Marriott building aren't there yet. But under this bridge here, on the north side of the river, this was kind of where the Papaschase peoples set up camp. They often set up camp on the north side because the fort was where kind of the legislature buildings in Edmonton are now. And this was kind of the traditional kind of camping areas. And my grandmother's grandmother was born under this bridge where the canoe's bow is pointing towards right now. And there was no city here at that time. There was none of this building. And I always like to think of just the, you know, the connection back to the land here and the generations of like tears and blood and good stories and songs and love and education and everything that happened right here in this river valley and along these lands before the city was built, and how we can start working together to try to reclaim that through education and creating that critical discourse where we're actually having these discussions around what we can do better to move things forward. And I truly believe that something like a bill or legislation or government acts or government policies aren't going to be the way forward, that movements are going to come from grassroots organizations that are led by youth and advised by elders and knowledge keepers. And so something like UNDRIP, it's a good framework to set kind of the tone for what that could look like legally and to have those conversations. But to move things forward, we all need to do our own part within our own lives and the way we educate each other and the conversations that we have towards Indigenous peoples and as we all know, with the movements that are happening across United States and Canada right now, how we can work in partnership too with those movements to create a better future for all peoples within this territory. Because I've heard from the elders on Enoch Cree Nation, where I've spent quite a bit of time, that, you know, when the treaties were signed for this area, Treaty 6 in particular, that the intent was that all peoples would be living together on this land in a shared harmonious way. And that this wasn't going to be, you know, where this was one group was going to be above all the rest, and that all these buildings that were built here were built as a result of that treaty that came from that and that allowed that to happen. But we need to start honoring those treaties from a differently than we have in the past, and that there needs to be a mutual upholding of the agreements and the benefits from those treaties so we can create, a better future together. So that's my short presentation here.
Awesome. Thank
Sure.
you so much, Connor, for that overview and understanding from your perspective and the things that you've participated in and the conversations you've heard, and especially around education and really understanding the tie to land-based and the impacts that has on because land-based opening education for all, like the principles of universal delivery is like building a ramp doesn't just help people who need a ramp, it helps everyone access.
Yeah.
And so, land-based education doesn't just help those who are Indigenous, it helps all peoples better understand the land, which is, integral to our future, whether it be climate change or even, like sage and sweetgrass and all those sort of medicines that exist that we don't know enough about.
So we recently had our Indigenous Studies diploma approved by the provincial government for Northwest College. And of course, one of the first kind of questions that the government asked us back when we were going through the accreditation process was like, oh, so this is just a program for Indigenous peoples. And we're like, no, that is absolutely not the case here. Like an Indigenous Studies program is to create, that mutual knowledge and understanding. It would that would just be like to say that, and it's an assumption that all Indigenous peoples are just going to want to take Indigenous studies and not just like I know so many people that would way rather be in like the sciences or the computer sciences or engineering or all these other disciplines, and not necessarily just being forced and pushed into these kind of different areas there. And then it's also important that we have a good broad community to have those kind of discussions.
Well, I'm going to open it up to questions here from anyone who's on Zoom, and if anyone does, you can type it in the chat, you can give me a wave, you can we'll do that. But we do have one that came in off the live stream, and it does have to relate to UNDRIP, because I know that I think it's Article 19 is about consultation and consent and cooperation, and seeking that sort of the approval, not really approval, but that dialogue with Indigenous peoples around access to their land. And so the question is, how do we balance rights, like human rights? I'm assuming, or feel free to clarify me on the live stream if I'm getting this wrong, but how do we balance rights and oil sands development / pipelines? And I know that's a big thing here in Alberta and Brazil and Australia. Like these are, in many countries, like how do we have these conversations where it's becoming more apparent to youth in particular that the rights and land rights of Indigenous peoples are tantamount. That is, our treaties are based on these, but also that, Alberta in particular, from this context and this question, probably Alberta based, is very pipeline and oil oriented. And how do you see those two relationships working together? They can be very contentious.
And I mean, once again, this is kind of just my opinion on that, but I've done a bit of work with an organization called Indigenous Climate Action that's led by Ariel Deranger, and they're absolutely phenomenal in what they kind of put forward and do. But one of the big pieces that I've kind of heard and chat about with other people's, like Chief Billy Morin out on Enoch Cree Nation, is just the advent of sustainable resource development and looking towards green technologies that can move us forward. And then the recognition that within the industries that exist right here, making sure that they're like as environmentally sound as absolutely possible. I think a lot of people are recognizing that, there's going to need to be a shift away from the technologies that have existed beforehand, but we need to make sure we're doing it in a proper way. And what we've kind of, seen in the past is unchecked development through traditional territories and lands and going through areas. Like if you look even in the city of Edmonton here, I know it's not oil sands based, but the EBCOR power plant, is right on the Rossdale, in the Rossdale Flats on the burial grounds of the Papas peoples and other Indigenous nations. And there's still not that recognition from EPCOR that they are in this spot in that area. And there's a big monument built there where there's still not a completed circle because EPCOR still hasn't done their part in the recognition and moving forward in their own relationships. And so we're looking at, you know, I think it's all comes back to that sustainable resource kind of development and moving forward with the ways of how we can create like a prosperous and I don't mean prosperous in the financial terms, but prosperous in how we're going to get our land back to a state where, you know, we're being able to sustain our resources from the communities, like, and the community resources around us. So we're looking at like the animals and whatnot. But one of the things with Indigenous peoples, like Korean Métis peoples in particular, is that they've been working within the fur trade and economic systems, Western economic systems that they've kind of helped develop and model themselves for 400, 500 years at this point in these areas here. And so there's and they control the economic trades here. Like this is very, especially in Edmonton and the Treaty 6 territories, there was very, and they were fully on with the idea of this economic area and our economic development and how to move forward with that. And I see a huge, you know, within my cousins work in the oil field. They work up north. They work on pipelines. They're either from Enoch Cree Nation or like the Métis communities around here, and they're very, you know, they just want a job. They just want to support their family. They just want to have that ability to put food on the table and for their kids to have a good, better opportunity. And they'll honestly do whatever it takes to create that if they need to. But then how do we put in place the sustainable requirements and the legislative requirements that we're not just going to destroy the North? And I know right now in Alberta, once again, my own personal opinion, but I'm quite upset about the selling off of provincial parklands, which are once again kind of based and built on the Indigenous traditional lands, but and then opening up coal activity along those areas as well. And so we're, you know, why was that given over to coal rights basically and not to Indigenous rights right from the get-go? And recognizing kind of the national park systems that have dispossessed Indigenous peoples and even having them come back into those ecotourism games that, or not games, I guess, like economic systems right now. Like Jasper Provincial Park was built on the Assiniboine Winawak peoples and the Métis peoples in that area and their dispossession and their displacement from the lands that they had lived on forever. And there still is no recognition of that. You know, there's kind of the token gestures and the odd monument here and there, but this was in the 1910s, 1920s when they torched all their homes and told them to get lost. And they ended up in the Grand Cache area afterwards and or dispossessed or displaced in the other kind of areas. But it wasn't like, there's still not that kind of dialogue to reclaim these kind of spaces and these places here.
We got a thanks.
Yeah.
But you know, these are, especially in Alberta, these are such hot topics, right? And just to understand that it's nuanced, that it's not black or white, it's not one person right, one person wrong, right? That there's, even within these conversations, there's arguments, and then within the arguments, there's more arguments, and that this is the grappling. This is part about being citizens of Canada, is grappling with these complex ideas, and that maybe there is no right answer, but that we're trying through these struggles to see all of the nuance and acknowledge it, right? Because if nothing, we want everyone to be heard, and yeah. So thank you so much for that answer.
I'd recommend looking into Indigenous climate action and the work that they've done, if you're ever looking for like follow-up resources on that.
Wonderful. So we have two more questions. Brenda, I see that her audio and visual is off, but if she wanted to jump in, she could read her question. Or I will, just to make sure we keep going, we have time for probably two questions here. And so she and her school are doing work with on salmon in the local provincial park, and they've included knowledge from local elders. And so when do you think it's okay for teachers or facilitators to share the knowledge they have learned from elders, and how?
That's a great question. And I think it's with that kind of recognition and that permission from those communities or those elders and knowledge keepers that you be in, or communities that you be engaging with as well. And I make sure that I'm very explicit in that I'm speaking for like myself and my family, and not necessarily the Métis community as a whole, or even like where Indigenous peoples or that. And that when I'm mentioning stuff like that, that story about that youth that I talked about, or that elders kind of teachings, that they are more than comfortable with me kind of saying those kind of pieces. And I'm not sure about the protocols on the BC peoples out there. With I'm only familiar kind of with the protocols in this territory here, but making sure that there's kind of that protocol given, and that mutual respect. And even for educators, looking into the resources that you have, and good resources will always kind of have a little like recognition in the book at some point on where these stories are coming from. When I worked for the public school board, we get these boxes of books from like publishing companies in Britain that have written a book about Métis peoples or Cree peoples, but there was no community engagement or no community recognition. And you're like, where are these stories coming from, or where is this coming from? And when you look into a lot of resources, it will say right at the beginning, like, this is a story told to me by, elders from the Lac-Saint Métis community. This is a story told to me from Bob Cardinal from Enoch Cree Nation, et cetera, et cetera. Like, they'll have that actual like recognition in that place there. And I think it's always important to remember to recognize the Indigenous educators in this aspect too, because there's been a huge dispossession of Indigenous knowledges and traditions through academia and other educational sources for a long time, without giving that recognition back to the people who've actually created these resources or done that. And so to make sure that we're honoring those voices and where it comes from. And honestly, most people will be more than happy that you'll be sharing these resources with youth, or chatting with youth, or having these conversations and sharing those kind of things. But I'm also very careful in my work, because I don't feel I've earned that right to not talk about kind of cultural things, and stay away from like a cultural show and tell. So I'm never like, all right, here's like smudging and we're gonna like smudge here, because I'm like, I do that, but I don't feel I have the right to be able to teach that kind of thing. And if I'm going to be teaching that kind of thing, I want to have the elder kind of present, or a knowledge keeper that can kind of help advise that conversation. Like, I can speak to a few more of those policy pieces, but not necessarily those cultural ones, unless I feel like I have those direct teachings. And so to make sure that we're staying away from kind of that sharing of kind of cultural knowledge without the exact, like the direct engagement with that community themselves, and having them present in there. But for like history pieces, stories, etc., those kind of things, like, if there's permission to share and that protocol is given, and that the proper recognition is also given, like, I would say that's a great spot to start from.
And I think beyond teachers, students are much more savvy in this, getting to be much more savvy in this as well, through like the ideas of cultural appropriation. And that's, I mean, that's talked about much more, simply from, like, whether it be, music, and, like Snotty Nose Red Kids, and Tribe Called Red, and there people are becoming much more, or even Halloween costumes, or the Edmonton Eskimos was in the news again this morning. Like, what are we gonna do about finally renaming? And and so I think there's a lot more, even as you were saying before, a push from the youth to make these changes, and to stop using voices that don't belong to you, or images, or cultural ideas. And so, like you were saying before, and Nicole, sort of, this is the last question. I realize we're on the hour, but such great questions. And this ties into her questions around, being led by youth, and then advised by elders, and having this sort of relationship between the two. And she's wondering, as a non-Indigenous educator who's committed to this idea, how can she help you know, like being sandwiched in between this led by youth and advised by elders. What is the role for, well, for educators, but also for students who want to champion these ideas, who want, how can we enact these? Is it education? Is it advocacy? How do we?
I think a big piece is creating space for those kind of conversations and dialogues that happen, or those educational opportunities, and doing your part to basically be able to set the tone in the conversation and bring those resources in that are Indigenous created for non-Indigenous peoples or students to basically get that happening. And I know in like Kelowna, like the chief of the West Bank, over in West Bank there, a guy named Chris, I've met him a few times at different conferences and things, and he's a phenomenal educator in person himself. I think he's the chair of Okanagan College for a long time there. And there's a lady named Gloria that's on the board there as well. But they, like, I mean, there's a lot of crazy good work that's already kind of happening, and just to make sure that we're like supporting it, and then allowing Indigenous peoples to be the recognized kind of leaders in those places too, and giving the credit back to the Indigenous communities as well, and not taking that. But that facilitation and the giving of space is a huge one there, because that's often just taken away. And then within the and I think that's always been something that I've been really trying to promote, even within the community college that we work in, is just giving students Indigenous students opportunities to share their stories if they wish, but not forcing it on them if they don't want to, as well as trying to not propagate the total the trauma porns that come from Indigenous topics often, but allowing for this dialogue to shift from one of negativity to positivity. Because you think of the resiliencies of Indigenous peoples throughout North America, throughout the world, which is really what UNDRIP's all about, let alone North America, these communities. It's absolutely astounding. And the amount of sheer resources and books and different articles and things that are out there now is just, it's ever increasing. And people need to take their own initiative though. And we're seeing that right now, even with the Black Lives Matter protests down in the States. But in Canada here with Indigenous education, it's often put on Indigenous peoples to have to do and it's draining to continually do little educational sessions for non-Indigenous peoples that non-Indigenous peoples can do on their own times, or on their own spaces. And there's tons of resources out there. There's tons of educator resources to look into, and to kind of make sure that they're not putting this emphasis on Indigenous peoples to often try to just continually have these little dialogue kind of conversations, but recognizing within your own work just that ability to give space there too, and starting with the community themselves and what they're kind of recognizing is what they want. And by community, I don't necessarily always mean elected officials or the education systems, but the families themselves. What do they want for their youth, for their future? And it's and making sure that's at the forefront of the conversations that go forward.
Well, Connor, we are definitely 4 minutes over. But that was an amazing, I wanted to get both those questions were amazing. And I wanted to make sure we got them in, and the ones from the live stream as well. I want to say thank you for everyone for joining us from Brazil to Kenya to Calgary to Markham, Ontario, all the way across the province, the country. It was wonderful having you, Connor. It was wonderful having you here, sharing your knowledge with us today. Thank you everyone for joining. We have another session on reconciliation next week. If you're interested, all of our stuff is online. I'll be sending lots of programming announcements out, but thank you for joining us today, everyone. Have a wonderful day or evening or sleep if you're already in bed, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.